North Atlantic Ocean, November 18, 1942, 03:47 hours. The ocean doesn't care about your rank, your orders, or how long you've been awake. Thomas "Tommy" Brennan learned this truth somewhere between his 48th and 49th hour without sleep, standing knee-deep in oily water that sloshed across the engine room floor of HMS Steadfast. The Flower-class corvette pitched violently as another massive wave struck her starboard side, and Tommy braced himself against the trembling bulk of the ship's triple-expansion steam engine. A mechanical heart that had been coughing, sputtering, and threatening to die for the past 2 days. Above him, somewhere beyond the claustrophobic steel tomb where he worked, the Battle of the Atlantic raged in its most merciless form. Convoy HX-217, 37 merchant vessels carrying fuel, food, and ammunition to Britain, was being systematically torn apart by a wolf pack of German U-boats. The screams of dying ships echoed across the water like the wails of prehistoric beasts, the tortured groan of buckling steel, the thunder of detonating cargo holds, the hiss of superheated metal meeting freezing seawater. But down here, in the bowels of Steadfast, Tommy heard only the irregular rhythm of pistons that shouldn't still be moving, the wheeze of steam lines that should have ruptured hours ago, and his own ragged breathing. He was 23 years old, a deckhand, the lowest rank in the engine room hierarchy, and he was the only thing standing between this corvette and the dark water, waiting to swallow her whole. 48 hours earlier, everything had been routine, or as routine as anything could be in the North Atlantic during the Wolfpack years. Tommy had been checking the condensers when Chief Engineer Patrick Sullivan found him. Sullivan was a barrel-chested Scotsman with 40 years of maritime service carved into the deep lines of his face, a man who could diagnose an engine problem by listening to it the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. "Brennan," Sullivan's voice cut through the engine noise, "temperature gauge on number 2 cylinder is reading hot. Have a look." It was a simple task, routine maintenance. Tommy grabbed his tools, a standard Navy-issue toolkit containing wrenches, hammers, scrapers, and measuring devices, and headed to the cylinder in question. What he found made his stomach drop. The bearing housing was cracked. Not obviously, not catastrophically, but enough that he could see the hairline fracture spreading across the cast iron like a frozen lightning bolt. He ran his fingers across it, feeling the heat radiating from metal that was grinding against itself with increasing fury. "Chief," Tommy called out, his voice carefully controlled, "we've got a problem." Sullivan came over, took one look, and his face went gray. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. The crack meant the bearing was failing. If it failed completely, the piston would seize, the connecting rod would snap, and the entire engine could destroy itself in a catastrophic failure that would leave them dead in the water. And in convoy operations, being dead in the water was just another way of being dead. "How long until it goes?" Sullivan asked. Tommy did the math in his head: rotation speed, temperature increase, metal fatigue patterns. 12 hours, maybe less if we push her hard. "We've got 3 days to Liverpool." "The convoy can't wait. The captain won't break formation." Sullivan's jaw worked back and forth, grinding on a decision. "Can you keep it running?" It wasn't really a question. It was an order wrapped in hope. "I'll do what I can, Chief." What Tommy didn't tell Sullivan, what he couldn't tell him, was that the standard repair procedures wouldn't work. The crack was in a place that couldn't be properly welded while the engine was running, and they couldn't shut down the engine without losing propulsion. The Navy manual had no solution for this specific problem. The official answer would be shut down, make repairs, restart when safe. But there was nothing safe about the North Atlantic in November 1942. That night, while the rest of the engine room crew rotated through their watches, Tommy sat on an overturned bucket next to the failing cylinder, thinking about his father. John Brennan had been a factory mechanic in Manchester before the war, not glamorous work but honest. He'd maintained the massive textile machines that ran 16 hours a day, machines that couldn't be stopped without costing the factory thousands of pounds. Tommy had spent his childhood summers in that factory, watching his father perform miracles with nothing but experience, intuition, and a peculiar collection of homemade tools. "The manual tells you what's supposed to work," his father had told him once, holding up a piece of bent steel that looked like it had been pulled from a scrapyard. "But sometimes you need something that's not in any manual, something that solves the problem they didn't know could happen." Man! In Tommy's personal toolbox, a battered metal case he'd carried since his first day in the Navy, there was a tool his father had made. It looked like a marriage between a wrench and a clamp, with a curved surface that could distribute pressure across an irregular surface. His father had used it to stabilize cracked housings on machines that couldn't be shut down. Tommy pulled it out now, weighing it in his hands. It was unauthorized, not in any Navy inventory. If the chief saw it, if any officer saw it, there would be questions about non-regulation equipment. But as he looked at the failing bearing housing, he knew it was his only chance. The principle was simple, but dangerous. By applying controlled external pressure at specific points around the crack, he could potentially slow its propagation. Not stop it, but slow it. Like holding together a broken bone long enough for help to arrive, the tool would need constant adjustment, constant monitoring. If he got the pressure wrong, he could accelerate the failure. If he got it right. Tommy began working at 02:00 hours when the engine room was quietest and fewest eyes were watching. The tool required precise positioning. Too much pressure, and the housing could shatter completely. Too little, and the crack would continue spreading. He worked by feel, by the heat in his hands, by the subtle changes in vibration he could sense through the metal. Every 20 minutes, he had to recalibrate, retighten, adjust for the temperature changes and stress cycles. It was like trying to defuse a bomb that was constantly rewinding itself. By dawn, the temperature gauge had stabilized. The crack had stopped growing. The cylinder ran rough, but it ran. Chief Sullivan found him still there at 06 Korsist, red-eyed and swaying with exhaustion. "What did you do?" the chief asked, staring at the gauge readings. "Redistributed the stress load," Tommy said, which was technically true. "It'll hold, but someone needs to monitor it constantly, adjust every 15 to 20 minutes. Sullivan looked at him for a long moment, then at the strange tool clamped to the bearing housing. He was experienced enough to recognize unauthorized equipment when he saw it. He was also experienced enough to recognize a miracle. "How long can you keep this up?" "As long as necessary, Chief." It was the kind of stupid, brave answer that gets men killed. It was also the truth. The U-boats found them on the second night. Tommy was in his third consecutive shift, 31 hours without real sleep, when the first torpedo struck a tanker 3 ships ahead in the convoy formation. The explosion lit up the night like a miniature sun, and through the thin steel hull of Steadfast, Tommy felt the shockwave as a physical blow that rattled his teeth. The corvette's battle station's alarm screamed to life, and above him Tommy heard the thunder of boots as the crew raced to their positions. Steadfast's primary role was anti-submarine warfare, and now she would earn her keep. In the engine room, Chief Sullivan's voice boomed over the communications tube. "All ahead full, and God help us, Brennan, that engine better not fail now." Tommy's hands moved on instinct, adjusting the pressure on the bearing housing. Even as the engine's revolution speed increased, the vibration intensified immediately, a dangerous thrumming that made the crack glow with heat. He could feel it wanting to fail, feel the metal straining against its own limitations. "Come on," he whispered, adjusting the tool's position by millimeters. "Just hold. Just a little longer." The corvette's depth charges began detonating, massive underwater explosions designed to crush U-boat hulls or force them to the surface. Each detonation sent shock waves through the water that hammered against Steadfast's hull and translated directly into her engine mounts. The failing bearing housing shuddered with each impact, and Tommy had to constantly readjust, compensate, predict where the next stress point would emerge. It was like trying to juggle while someone was shooting at you. The battle lasted 4 hours, 4 hours of continuous high-speed maneuvering, of depth charge attacks, of the corvette's 4-inch deck gun firing at surfaced U-boats caught in the searchlights. 4 hours of Tommy standing at his post, hands moving in constant micro-adjustments, fighting to keep the engine running while the ship fought to stay alive. They lost 6 merchant ships that night. 1,200 men went into the North Atlantic's freezing water, and fewer than 300 were pulled out alive. But Steadfast survived. Her engine, against all probability, kept running. When dawn finally came and the U-boats withdrew to recharge their batteries, Tommy's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold a wrench. Chief Sullivan came down personally to check on him and found Tommy still standing at his post, eyes fixed on the temperature gauges with the intensity of a man in a religious trance. "Brennan," Sullivan said gently, "when did you last sleep?" "What day is it, Chief? You need rest?" "The bearing needs adjustment every 15 minutes. "Who else can do it?" Sullivan looked at the jury-rigged tool, at the engine running with impossible smoothness, despite the crack that should have killed it. "I'll learn." "Show me." "With respect, Chief, it took me years to understand how my father's tool works. You'd need time we don't have." Tommy met his eyes. "I can do this. I just need coffee and maybe some of Cookie's sandwiches." It was insane. It violated every naval regulation about crew rest and duty hours. It was also their only option. "All right," Sullivan said quietly, "but if you collapse, I'm shutting her down, and to hell with the convoy." "Fair enough, Chief." Neither of them believed it. They both knew the engine would run until it couldn't, and Tommy would stand beside it until that moment came. There's a point beyond exhaustion where the mind starts negotiating with reality. Tommy reached it somewhere around the 56th hour, when the faces of the other engine room crew began to blur together, and he started seeing his father standing beside him, offering advice in a voice that seemed to come from the machinery itself. "Listen to her breathing, Tommy. She'll tell you what she needs." The crack had developed 3 smaller branches now, spreading like roots seeking water. Each branch required individual attention, individual compensation. The tool his father had made was designed for one stabilization point, so Tommy had improvised additional bracing using wire, clamps, and strips of rubber cut from old gaskets. The whole assembly looked like something a mad inventor would create, but it worked. Every adjustment required mathematical precision he no longer had the mental energy to calculate unconsciously, so he operated on instinct, feeling the heat, sensing the vibration patterns, knowing in some deep primal way when to tighten and when to release. The other crew members watched him with a mixture of awe and concern. This wasn't normal mechanical work. This was something else, a kind of mechanical faith, a conversation between man and machine conducted in the language of pressure and temperature and vibration. Petty Officer James Walsh, a veteran mechanic with 15 years of service, stood beside Tommy during one adjustment and shook his head in wonder. "That crack should have killed us yesterday. What you're doing, I don't even understand what you're doing." Tommy's laugh was a ragged sound. "Honestly, neither do I anymore. I just—" "Listen to her. She tells me what she needs." Walsh gave him a worried look. "When did you last eat?" "Cookie brought me a sandwich." Or was that yesterday? Time had become fluid, meaningless. There was only the engine, the crack, the adjustment cycle. "Brennan, you're hallucinating." "Probably, but the engine's still running, isn't it?" Walsh couldn't argue with that. The U-boats came back for one last attempt just after midnight on the third day. This time, they struck with coordinated precision, 3 submarines attacking from different angles simultaneously, launching a spread of torpedoes that forced the convoy to scatter. Steadfast heeled hard to starboard, her engines straining as she maneuvered to protect a crippled freighter. In the engine room, Tommy felt the bearing housing shift under the extreme maneuver. The crack, which had been stable for the past 12 hours, suddenly expanded, a visible line of red-hot metal spreading across the iron surface like lightning. "No," Tommy breathed. "Not now. Not when we're this close." He knew, with the absolute certainty that comes from extreme exhaustion and mechanical intuition, that the bearing had perhaps 20 minutes left. Maybe 30, if he was lucky. The metal had been stressed beyond its design limits for too long. The laws of physics were coming due. Above him, the depth charges began again, a thunderous rhythm that spoke of desperation and fury. The corvette's commander, Lieutenant Commander David Morrison, was fighting to save not just his own ship but the entire convoy. Every minute Steadfast remained operational was another minute of protection for the merchant vessels. Tommy looked at his father's tool, the unauthorized, unorthodox, impossible piece of equipment that had kept them alive this long. It had reached its limits. The pressure distribution it provided was no longer enough. Then, in a moment of clarity that cut through the fog of exhaustion, Tommy understood what he had to do. The steam lines ran directly above the bearing housing. If he could redirect just a small amount of steam flow, not enough to affect the engine's operation, but enough to provide direct cooling to the cracked area, he might buy them the final hours they needed to reach the anti-submarine aircraft patrol zone around Britain. It was dangerous. One wrong move, and he'd flood the engine room with superheated steam that would scald everyone in it. But the alternative was engine failure, and that meant death for everyone aboard. His hands moved with the practiced precision of a surgeon, despite trembling with fatigue, loosening a small valve, adjusting a bypass pipe, creating a controlled leak that would direct cooling steam precisely where it was needed. The temperature gauge began to drop, slowly at first, then more steadily. The crack's expansion halted. The engine's rhythm smoothed. "Dear God," Chief Sullivan whispered, watching Tommy's improvisation with the wide eyes of a man witnessing something that shouldn't be possible. "You magnificent crazy bastard." Tommy barely heard him. He was making final adjustments, calculating steam pressure versus cooling effect versus structural stress, solving equations his exhausted mind could barely comprehend, but his hands somehow knew how to execute. When he finished, he looked up at Sullivan with eyes that seemed to have aged years in 3 days. "That'll hold until we reach port, Chief. I'm sure of it." Then finally, his legs gave out, and he collapsed. Tommy woke up in the sick bay to the sound of seagulls and the gentle rocking of a ship at anchor. For a moment, panic seized him, the engine, the bearing, the crack, but then he realized the quality of the motion was all wrong. They weren't at sea anymore. The engines were silent. Chief Sullivan was sitting beside his bunk, looking like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. "Welcome back, Brennan. You've been out for 14 hours. The engine?" "Made it all the way to Liverpool, 71 hours and 43 minutes of continuous operation under combat conditions. The dockyard engineers took one look at your setup and couldn't believe it actually worked." Sullivan paused, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved this ship, son. Saved every man aboard her." Tommy tried to sit up, but his body refused. Every muscle felt like it had been beaten with hammers. "Just did my job, Chief." "Your job ended after the first shift. What you did after that was something else entirely." Sullivan held up the curved tool, Tommy's father's creation. "The captain wants to know what this is and where you got it." Fear lanced through Tommy's exhaustion. Unauthorized equipment, violation of regulations, court-martial. Sullivan must have seen it in his face, because he smiled, a rare expression. "Relax, Brennan. The captain wants to know so he can recommend it for adoption by the fleet. He's writing you up for the Distinguished Service Medal. Says any tool that can keep an engine running under those conditions deserves to be in every ship's equipment locker." Tommy stared at him, unable to process the words. "There's something else," Sullivan continued. "The Admiralty sent an engineering team here to inspect the engine. They want to interview you, understand exactly what you did. Seems there are a lot of ships out there with bearing problems, and nobody's figured out how to handle them during combat operations. You might have just solved a problem that's been killing ships since the war started. I listened to the engine, like my father taught me." "Well, your father taught you something the Royal Navy apparently never learned." Sullivan stood up, preparing to leave, then paused. "Brennan, I've been sailing for 40 years. I've seen brave men and skilled men and lucky men. But what you did these past 3 days, I've never seen anything like it. You have a gift, a genuine gift." After Sullivan left, Tommy lay in the bunk, staring at the ceiling and feeling the strange disconnect of survival. They'd made it. Against physics, against probability, against the German wolf packs, and the North Atlantic's fury, they'd made it. He thought about the men who hadn't, the 1,200 who'd gone into the water during those 3 nights, the ships that had burned and sunk while Steadfast ran her impossible mission on an engine that shouldn't have worked. Why had they survived when others hadn't? Was it skill? Luck? The unauthorized tool his father had made in a Manchester factory? Or was it something simpler, the stubborn refusal of one exhausted deckhand to let his engine die while men still depended on it? Tommy didn't know. He suspected he'd spend the rest of his life trying to answer that question. The official report on HMS Steadfast's remarkable crossing eventually reached the Admiralty's Department of Engineering Innovation. The tool Tommy's father had created, which Tommy had improved during those desperate 72 hours, was analyzed, tested, and eventually adapted for use across the Royal Navy's corvette fleet. It was never called Brennan's tool in official documentation. The Navy, in its institutional wisdom, designated it the Emergency Bearing Stabilization Device, Mark Weiss. Dean, but among engine room crews throughout the Atlantic Fleet, it became known simply as the Ghost's Wrench, named after the ghost-like deckhand who'd stayed awake for 3 days, talking to an engine that shouldn't have run, using a tool that shouldn't have worked. Thomas Brennan survived the war. He received his Distinguished Service Medal in a quiet ceremony in Portsmouth, attended by Chief Sullivan and the crew of Steadfast. He served on 4 more convoy runs before the Navy, recognizing his unique skills, assigned him to a training facility where he taught other engine room crews how to perform emergency repairs under combat conditions. After the war, he returned to Manchester and worked alongside his father in the same textile factory, maintaining the same machines, using the same improvised tools. He rarely spoke about those 3 days in November 1942, but occasionally, when asked by younger mechanics how he solved impossible problems, he would smile and repeat his father's wisdom. The manual tells you what's supposed to work. But sometimes you need something that's not in any manual, something that solves the problem they didn't know could happen. And sometimes you just need to listen, really listen to what the machine is trying to tell you. The cracked bearing housing from Steadfast's engine was preserved and eventually donated to the Imperial War Museum in London, where it sits today in a small display case. Next to it is a battered, curved piece of steel that looks like it was pulled from a factory scrapyard, a tool made by a father's hands, carried by a son to war, and used to save 93 lives during 72 impossible hours. The placard reads, Emergency Bearing Stabilization Device, 1942. Used during the successful convoy crossing of HMS Steadfast under continuous U-boat attack, represents the ingenuity and determination of Royal Navy personnel during the Battle of the Atlantic. But if you look closely, stamped into the metal in small, rough letters, you can still see the words John Brennan had marked there before giving it to his son for problems they don't know can happen. And in the end, that might be the truest description of war, an endless series of problems nobody knew could happen, solved by ordinary people who refused to accept that solutions were impossible. Tommy Brennan was just a deckhand, the lowest rank in the engine room, but for 72 hours in November 1942, while the North Atlantic tried to kill them and the wolf packs hunted in the darkness and the engine screamed with metal fatigue, he was something more. He was the thin line between life and death, between mechanical failure and survival, between the cold water and home. He was a man who listened to machines and heard what they needed to survive, and that made all the difference. The End author's note. This story is a work of historical fiction inspired by the real experiences of Royal Navy engine room crews during the Battle of the Atlantic. While HMS Steadfast and Thomas Brennan are fictional characters, the technical challenges described, bearing failures during combat operations, impossible repair situations, and the ingenuity of enlisted personnel, are based on documented incidents from World War II convoy operations. The Battle of the Atlantic claimed over 72,000 Allied naval and merchant marine personnel between 1939 and 1945, making it one of the longest and most critical campaigns of the war.